I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. I want to thank you for joining me and being a part of this program. Yes, it is. It's January 1st. Well, at least in New York, it's January 1st. By the time this airs in Washington, it'll be the 2nd. But it is the new year. For all intents and purposes, it is the new year. But I have to say, it's only new if we make it new. We can keep reliving the past. And look, and if there's one thing I get accused of, it's oftentimes bringing up ugly and uncomfortable truths of history. And there's a reason I do it, not to relive it, but to remind people of what has transpired and why we need to move past it, why we need to correct the um, the wrongs and the ills of the past. The problem is that we don't seem to do that. In fact, in the United States in particular, we seem to be regressing in the U.S. politics and in societally and all in any number of other ways. So let me begin by welcoming my listening audience to both WBAI in New York City and WPFW in Washington, D.C. As always, it is a privilege and an honor to be a part of your day, a part of your listening experience. And of course, you may be listening to us on Facebook or watching us on Facebook or on YouTube or listening to us as a podcast. So, however you listen, I do want to say thank you as we close out 2025. We did reach some goals that we were attempting to reach in terms of fundraising for both stations. And I want to thank you for helping us get there and being a part of sustaining these radio stations and this radio program. I want to thank you for that. Um, Without you, we can't do what we do here. And I think what we do here is important. So as we enter 2026, there's a lot of things that are going to come before us. For me personally, all of my children will have reached 40 years or above. So that's kind of a strange thing to suggest that all my kids will be in their 40s. But that's what that's the world that I live in. 3 kids, 10 grandchildren. Many of you know because I talk about them often. I talk about my family. Been married for 44 years, or will be 44 years this year. This is the priority. What everything else that I do is is secondary to my home, to my family, and to the people that I work with and work for. And when I say work for, I don't mean from an employment standpoint. I mean the work that I do is specifically for Native people, both in the community that I live in, Seneca Territory, Cattaraugus Territory, the Seneca Nation. As a Mohawk, as a Haudenosaunee, as Ongwumwe, I feel like I have a responsibility, and I don't take that responsibility lightly. So I take it both as a parent, a grandparent, and as a community member, as a Native person who is working, again with and for other Native people. I'm gonna, but I do need to address what what is 2026 going to look like, and part of it again, I think in order for us to realize a new year, we have to adopt perhaps some new ways of thinking. Here's what we're going to face. We're going to face the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So we're going to see much of the early part of the year be geared towards this American celebration. The problem is that nobody's going to bother to read the damn thing or understand uh, what's in the text or what is the context of the text. And that's unfortunate because I think there's a lot that's revealing about what was going to happen with these folks who were declaring their independence. There's a lot that's telling in it. You can get a sense for the white supremacy. You can get a sense for the greed, but only if you look for it. I mean, on the face of it, look, there are many Americans who are going to say, oh, it's one of the greatest documents ever produced. Well, from a Native standpoint, you referred to us as merciless Indian savages. You complained that the king was limiting your ability to go into our and steal more of our territories. That's part of the Declaration of Independence that sticks out for me. But of course, the United States, they're going to be celebrating their 250th anniversary, or birthday, I guess, or whatever you want to call it, on July 4th of this year. So we're going to see a lot of that stuff. And there's going to be a lot of rhetoric. There's going to be a lot of propaganda. There's going to be a lot of politicizing that celebration, especially with the current administration, it is going to be, I guess, for lack of a better word, it's going to be a debacle. It's going to be insanity. But we have to be prepared for it, and I think we have to use our own critical thinking, accept our own cognitive dissonance, and that's the fact that we live in a world that we know isn't right. We are doing things in our lives every single day that we know violate our core values and principles. Even the things that are mentioned in things like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and so many of those words and those quotes that are attributed to the founding fathers of the U.S. and the framers of the Constitution and of their declarations. We got to look at those words, and we have to understand the lie and the misdirection. I mean, we live in a world where misinformation and misdirection is part of our daily lives, but it's always been. One of the things that I always have to remind people is that the system isn't broken. It was designed this way. And if you parse much of the language of the Declaration of Independence, it's really foreboding. I mean, it really does predict the future. And I'm not going to get into that right now. There's going to be plenty of time to do that in the run up to July 4th. Of course, the other thing that's going to be way heavy and play prominently in the media, talking heads, on news, on cable, on podcasts, is the fact that the United States is entering into its midterm election season. So come November, the power could shift. It may not. It could shift. And you could see the Democrats come away with a lot more seats in the Senate and in Congress, and maybe take it over essentially. I'm not making any predictions. I think the Democrats have a unique and uncanny ability to seize defeat from the jaws of victory, in spite of Epstein files and the debacle that this current administration is. I think the Democrats could still screw it up. So again, I won't sit here and say that I'm rooting for them, but I got to tell you, this is some of the worst of the worst leadership and governance that I've experienced in my lifetime. I can't say it's the worst ever because the United States lived through or our people specifically lived through Andrew Jackson and Civil War and massacres and extinction and termination and extermination. We lived through a lot, but we're still here. And part of what I'm going to be emphasizing over this year is not going to be their elections and their celebrations. It's going to be about our identity. And of course, as many of you know, I was involved with producing a film this past year that we rolled out at the end of not until the last quarter of the year. So I'm going to spend a great deal of this year promoting The Long Hope, the film that the full-length feature film documentary that myself, Ross John, and Holly John, and others were involved in. We're going to continue to take it on the road. I hope to travel with it a lot more than I was able to at the close of this past year. I'm hoping to utilize the film to promote our message. And our message is, at its core, I got to say, at its core, it is about reclaiming our identity. Now, we can't reclaim our identity if we're still being regarded as wards of the federal government. We can't reclaim our identity if Congress is insisting that they have every bit of the power required to regulate our entire lives. That's not our identity. That's what we're living through. That's what we're still resisting. So when you watch The Long Hope, you're going to understand a little bit more of what the fight is. But you may not come out of that watching that film, and it's a 2-hour film, so it's not look, it's pretty intense. We cover a lot of ground. But what we don't spell out specifically, although it's mentioned, our identity is mentioned, we are in a constant battle to reclaim our identity. I mean, coming right out of the gate, I mean, what people struggle with what to even call us. I mean, the Smithsonian Native Museum, which is called the National Museum of the American Indian, they caused trouble right from the start. American Indian. I'm not an American, and I'm not an Indian, and I'm not an American Indian. But even the magazine that they produce, I just commented it on a post today. Um, I mean, that's the name of their magazine, American Indian. It's like I'm neither of those, or neither of the three of those. It says individually or together, and I don't accept the imposition of that label. And let's be clear, it is an imposition. The word Indian is a misnomer. It's a mistake by Columbus, believing he had reached the Indies. And in spite of what George Carlin or anybody else says, Russell Means, in spite of what anybody else may say, the word Indians was a misnomer. It was a mistake. It was an error. It wasn't some attempt to associate us with God or God's people or any of that stuff. And that's all crap. It's all BS. So reject that out of hand, please. Please reject that out of hand. But the idea that this name has stuck, and even look, many native peoples have incorporated that word Indians into their identity. I mean, the Seneca Nation was calling themselves, although they started to distance themselves from it, the Seneca Nation of Indians. It's like being Seneca wasn't enough, and even Seneca is still a label that has been basically cast upon us. I mean, our words for who we are. I'm sit here, and most of you know I'm Mohawk, but that our word is Gunyagahaga, the people of the land of Flint. The Senecas are not Senecas. They are Onondaga. They are the people of the big hills or the mountains. We are all Haudenosaunee or Rudenosaunee. We are all Ungwe. We're a part of the Longhouse, what people consider the Confederacy or the Six Nations. But these labels that have been imposed upon us stick. And then they start to take on other meanings. And of course, they get appropriated for for mascots. They get appropriated for team names. They get appropriated for company names. I mean, it used to be the utility provider to this area was called Niagara Mohawk. Both of those are native. Well, one is a native word, Niagara, and of course Mohawk is again a bit of a misnomer. There are towns and villages and rivers and everything else that bear names that are either bastardized words, native words, or words that people associate with who we are. And of course, the mascot issue, which I've addressed a lot over the last several years. These are all things that complicate who we are because they are essentially appropriations of our identity. And of course, we also have the problem that people label as pretendianism, where you've got non-native people pretending to be native people. You've got native people who have essentially bailed so much on their own culture that they redefine themselves. I've been engaged a little bit in the conversation over the Lumbees gaining federal recognition because of Trump's big push to have them federally recognized. And and the problem there being, it's not to say that those people who claim to be Lumbees aren't native. Most of them, and I believe most of them, are in fact natives. But they are not Lumbees. Lumbees is a made-up term. It's a made-up expression. It's a derogatory or pejorative slang term that was used for native people who lived along a river that was renamed by white folks as the Lumber River. So the white folks just called the native people who lived there Lumbees. There's no Lumbee language. There's no Lumbee culture. What there is there's Tuscarora. There's Cherokee. There's the Creek. There are other native peoples who either adopted or accepted this label of Lumbee, and then tried to claim that as their identity. And they claimed it all the way up to the federal government, and they got it recognized through a congressional act, through the National Defense Authorization Act, which is again, they attach all these other things to it, and Trump pushed like hell to have the Lumbees federally recognized. Why? Because they supported him. It's a quid pro quo with Donald Trump on everything. So, and I'm not suggesting that the Lumbees are pretending to be native peoples. I'm just saying that they're pretending to be something that they're not. And like I said, there are cultural there's cultural ancestry associated with most of those people. And when I get accused of erasure by not accepting that, look, I mean, it is what it is. Federal government, they claim that they exist. It's not up to me to accept that. But it is a matter of fact that the federal government, through their Congress, through their plenary powers doctrine, their ultimate power to determine everything about Native people, have created what I call a Trump tribe, and that's what they've done with the Lumbees. Now, again, I know people in the area. I know the Tuscarora down there. I know some of the folks down there. I know Cherokee. I know Tuscarora. I know some of those people down there, and I know some of the people are conflicted because they are Tuscarora, but they have seen some benefit in being included as a part of the Lumbee population. And I think there's like, I mean, they claim there's 60,000 of them, which is a pretty big number. And you don't get to that number simply because you're of a population explosion. You do that by appropriating other people's identities. But again, so identity is going to be a big issue. And even for these people claiming to be Lumbees now, they're going to have to sort out, well, what does it mean? What does it mean to be federally recognized? Because I'll tell you what the federal definition is. It's a tribe, band, or nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States. So what if those laws are wrong? What if they're illegal? What if they're unconstitutional? I mean, even though it's not my constitution, what if it is? And that's, of course, that's what The Long Hope is all about. That's what our film is all about. So as we go forward, the idea of reclaiming, and I do say reclaiming because look, our identities have been all muddled up. Most Native people are fully involved at some level in an identity crisis. And of course, look, we see people say, "Well, are you an American?" No, I'm not. So there you go. That's another problem. There's another issue associated with our identity. How do we identify ourselves? I saw somebody on social media. They had a shirt and it said, God, country, something, and then MAGA or Trump or something like that. And they said that was his, his pecking order about how he identifies himself. As a Christian, as an American, as a Trump follower, in that order or something along those lines. Well, I got to tell you, it's really problematic if you first and foremost identify yourself politically, as opposed to culturally. And look, politics isn't a culture. Politics may be a part of culture, but it's not a culture all by itself. I had somebody ask me, well, I hope you're not mad at me, but I'd really like to talk to you as a Republican. And I'm thinking, well, you just nipped that conversation in the bud, because if you are claiming to be Native, but you are identifying not as Native, but you're identifying yourself by a political party, one whose hallmark is racism, yeah, I'm probably not that thrilled about having a conversation with you. It's not that I won't, especially when I open up phone lines here on the radio show, and anybody can call in, and I'll take all callers. But if you really want to have a conversation with me, and you identify yourself as a Republican or a Trump follower, or first and foremost as a Christian or as a whatever, and not as a human being. If you move yourself so far away from this idea, and our word is ungwe ungwe, a real human being. Now you've already dismissed yourself as a human being by defining yourself politically. Especially, you're defining yourself not by politics that you've identified, but by politics that have already been identified. And that's what's problematic. And I say the same thing about anybody who says, well, I want to talk to you as a Democrat. Well, there you go. That's problematic too. So it's going to be an interesting year because there's going to be a lot of American stuff that's going to be thrust out in front of everybody between their midterm elections and their celebration of their birthday. But every step along the way, Native people are going to be challenged. We're going to be challenged about who we are, both from those who are trying to appropriate our identities and those who are trying to diminish them or eliminate them or erase them. And appropriation is an erasure as well. Now, I say that, in the mascot battle, I always say, look, but people say, well, if you're getting rid of the mascots, you're just trying to erase Native people. No, your mascot is what erases us. That's the problem. I mean, therein lies the problem. The problem is that you're not acknowledging any of the history. So as we sit here on January 1st, let me remind people, and I talked about it last week, but this is the anniversary of a couple of days after the anniversary of the massacre at Wounded Knee. And that was essentially the last, what they consider the bookend of the Indian Wars of the United States. It was a massacre. It was an attempt to exterminate people. And when I say exterminate, I'm not even the one who coins that as an expression. L. Frank Baum, the author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, he actually called for it. He called for extermination. He called for extermination, and um, and said it was the only thing that could be done to secure the peace and security of basically white folks. He, and after the massacre, and that would be on January 3rd of 1891. Let me read. Let me read what he wrote. He said, this is called the Wounded Knee editorial. It says, the peculiar policy of the government in employing so weak and vacillating a person as General Miles to look after the uneasy Indians has resulted in a terrible loss of blood to our soldiers, and a battle which at best is a disgrace to the War Department. There has been plenty of time for prompt and decisive measures, the employment of which would have prevented this disaster. The Pioneer, which is the newspaper that L. Frank Baum is writing in here, the Pioneer has before declared that our only safety depends upon the total extermination of the Indians. Having wronged them for centuries, we had better, in order to protect our civilization, follow it up with one more wrong and wipe these untamed and untamable creatures from the face of the earth. In this lies future safety for our settlers and the soldiers who are under incompetent commands. Otherwise, we may expect future years to be full of trouble with the Redskins as they have in the past years. So, I mean, this was a newspaper on the frontier that was calling for our extermination. And then, basically, afterwards, he wasn't criticizing the fact that it was a disgrace because of what they did to the native people. He was basically criticizing it because they shot themselves. And, of course, the current, to add some contemporary, absurdity to it, the current defense secretary, who was, again, once again referring to the Defense Department as the War Department, has basically affirmed the medals of honor that were issued to the soldiers who were involved in this massacre at Wounded Knee, who were involved with murdering women and children, predominantly. In fact, one of those guys was from Niagara Falls, in our neck of the woods. In fact, some of our guys we had terrible weather, so I didn't make it out this year. But we usually do a gathering at one of these veterans parks in Niagara Falls, where they have a monument honoring the guy by the name of his last name was Toy, who received a Medal of Honor as a part of murdering women and children at Wounded Knee. And the current defense secretary is affirming those medals because there's been a call. And again, Native people have called for a review of those medals to have them rescinded. And Pete Hegseth said, no way. No. We're honoring those people, and we will always honor them. Those medals will never be rescinded. So at this point, it goes beyond doubling down on the atrocity and claiming it as something honorable. This, it's been done year after year after year. So obviously nothing changes with this administration. It actually gets worse. So that's kind of the anniversary that we're in the midst of. But the other anniversary I got to mention, which is from a little bit of a different time period, close in many ways the same. But so January 1st is the anniversary of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And, of course, I always have to put that in context because people they don't understand what the Emancipation Proclamation was. It wasn't about freeing the slaves in the United States. It was about declaring that the slaves held in the rebel states, the states that had seceded from the United States, the ones who were basically warring against the United States, that the United States, the president, in his Emancipation Proclamation, was proclaiming that those enslaved were now free. There were still slaves in the northern states that hadn't seceded, like from New Jersey and other states. So there were slaves that were still being held as slaves in the northern states, but in the southern states, the president of the United States came out and declared that they were now free, whatever that means, because there was no act of Congress yet. This was just a, like an executive order kind of thing. Now, but I also have to put it in perspective because this came a week after the largest mass execution in the history of the United States. And I talked about this last week, but I gotta bring it up again. So, the day after Christmas in 1862, again, the day after Christmas, but a week before the Emancipation Proclamation, 38 Dakota were hanged as a result of a military trial where they were tried as enemy combatants. Actually, over 300 of them were actually found guilty and sentenced to death. But Lincoln thought that would look bad, so he wanted the number down to something manageable. Well, they managed it all right. They brought it down to 38, and they built this massive gallows in Mankato, Minnesota, to fulfill this execution order signed by Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, the Emancipation Proclamation guy. Yeah, the largest mass execution guy as far as we're concerned. So, on December 26th, day after Christmas, the good people of Mankato, and by some estimates, thousands of them came out to watch this historic event. And in fact, it was such a historic event that there were souvenirs and memorabilia created. I posted it on Facebook. There was like these engraved spoons that showed a picture of the hanging. There were medals that were engraved. There were paintings, and in fact, there was a commemorative beer tray that was manufactured by one of the breweries in that area to commemorate and to stamp historically this proud American event, the execution of 38 Dakota in Mankato, Minnesota, signed by Abraham Lincoln a week before the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, one of the things I brought up last week was that it's worth noting that no one, well, I take it back. I was informed that one person, only one person, was tried and executed as a result of the treason, sedition, and atrocities committed during the Civil War. So 1 million people died. By some estimates, as many as 1 million people died as a result of this war of treason and sedition. And yet, virtually no one was tried for treason. No one was executed. One person who committed must have been, he must have really wronged the wrong people because only one human being was tried and executed as a result of the atrocities committed in the Civil War. And yet, 300 would be tried and sentenced to death, Native people, who were not, they hadn't declared war against the United States. The United States declared war against them. They were regarded as enemy combatants because they were trying to survive. They were trying to live in the wake of Lincoln's Homestead Act, which was depriving them of livelihoods, of the ability to live and survive. They were starved. In fact, ironically, the same General Miles that L. Frank Baum talked about in his editorial, he basically said that even in 1890, the Native people were being starved into rebellion. Well, that's exactly what took place in 1862. They were being starved into rebellion. They were being starved into trying to capture some means to survive and to sustain themselves. Because their lands, they were being driven off their lands, not by, this image of Michael Landon and his little girls in Little House on the Prairie. We were talking about violent men who had left the East, come to a world where they knew the rules didn't apply. And of course they didn't apply. Again, consider the fact that Native people, as prisoners of war, could be tried and executed, but no white people who committed much more heinous crimes were responsible for much greater loss of life than all of the Native conflicts combined. If you combine all of the Native conflicts, I don't think you can come up with us being responsible for 1 million deaths of white folks. Yet that's how many people died as a result of the Civil War. So when we look at the anniversaries, and I'm going to still do history. I'm still going to do history, even though I'm going to try to contemporize most of what I talk about. I think it's important. This does have a contemporary connection to it because we're still living in a world where the federal government treats Native people as a subclass of human existence. Look, you can't tell a people that you're wards of the federal government without any tests for that. I mean, there's no assessment on whether we have some sort of mental deficiency or physical deficiency or, or a development deficiency of some sort. No, the federal government just declared that all Native people, and look, we're like almost 1,000 distinct Native peoples, but simply based on the United States designation of Native people as a race, they passed this racist legal doctrine called the trust doctrine, where we are cast as wards of the federal government. And this isn't something that we can graduate from. It's not like there's, okay, well if you pass a test, we will let you graduate from your wardship status, and then you can be considered a real human being, an adult, a competent adult. No, there was no competency test. In fact, many Native people were forced to declare themselves as incompetent just to collect their own resources. I'm thinking about, if you, not just the scene, but the fact of the matter associated with the Osage, who were the wealthiest people on the planet in the early 1900s. And yet, in order to have access to their own oil wealth, they had to accept a guardian appointed to them, and they had to declare that they were too incompetent themselves individually, and they had to basically, pray to their guardian to have access to any of their wealth. I mean, this is the world. I mean, again, this is the 20th century. Okay, this is the 20th century we're talking about here. So where are we now? So several years after these mass killings of the Osage over oil wealth, the United States decides they're going to declare us to be U.S. citizens, but we're still considered wards of the federal government. So when I talk about all this history, whether it's in our film, The Long Hope, or whether it's what I'm doing here on my show on a weekly basis, part of it is to frame what still exists today. What still exists today. And of course, in the midst of all this stuff is, again, our identity challenge. The fact that, that we are represented by Hollywood or by television or by mascots or by, the federal government calling us Indians or American Indians or Native Americans or whatever the label is they stick on us. And oftentimes, almost refusing to accept our own names, our own identities. Look, one of the things that happened for 150 years is Native kids were ripped from their homes and sent off to these boarding schools to have the quote-unquote Indian beaten out of them, killed. Kill the Indian, save the man. That was the slogan, right? One of the first things they did was take away any Native names. Not only did they take away the language, but the very names that these children had. Instead, they were given biblical names like John and Joshua and Sarah and Mary, Isaac. Yeah, these were the names that were imposed upon these kids. So any name that came from their people, from their culture, from their language, those are struck. They were struck. They were gone. So not only were we going to hack off your hair, get rid of any identifiable items that you might have had that associated with your culture, we were going to forbid your language, we were going to forbid your name, and we were going to do everything we could to strip your identity away. At the same time, and this is the thing that I always got to bring up, at the same time, white kids were being able to call themselves Indians as a part of their school upbringing. They could be the Cambridge Indians, or they could be the chiefs or the warriors or the savages or or whatever name they wanted to choose, the Braves, the Warriors. That's what they did. They took our identity as they were stripping our identity from our own children. And of course, I always tie this back to L. Frank Baum, because L. Frank Baum, when he was calling for our extermination, he basically said, "Why not annihilation? Their glory is fled, their spirit broken, their manhood effaced. Better that they die than live the miserable wretches that they are. History would forget these latter despicable beings and speak in later ages of the glory of these grand kings of the forest and plain." The worst part about that quote is that he's right. Because now they speak about us as if we're these these noble savages that they want to emulate on their football fields or whatever, on their sports fields, in athletics. That's so they call for our extermination and actually do exterminate us. They do murder and massacre. And look, the deaths that came about to Native people came in many different ways. There were scalp bounties. People who were paid to murder us and basically get paid based on the scalps that they could take from our dead bodies, the red skins that they would strip from our bodies. There was the distribution of disease blankets. Lord Jeffrey Amherst, in case you wonder where does that name Amherst come from? There's all these little towns called Amherst in Massachusetts, frankly, right here in the Buffalo area. There's one of the suburbs is called Amherst. It all comes from Lord Jeffrey Amherst. And from a native perspective, his claim to fame from our perspective is that he's the one who wrote the letters who encouraged the distribution of disease-infected blankets to wipe out our population. It is really, literally, the first written account and use of germ warfare as a means to exterminate a people. Lord Jeffrey Amherst, Lord, he was a lord, and that's what he called for. So the spread of disease that came through our territories wasn't by accident. In fact, most of it, if it didn't come from these disease blankets for infected by smallpox, a lot of it was to destroy our health in such a manner that we would be susceptible to things like the Spanish flu or any influenza, any disease that could come our way, tuberculosis, whatever the current or contemporary pandemic was. Native people were impacted by it the most because we were already being starved and diminished from a physical stature and from a health standpoint significantly. So we were the most vulnerable. And of course, there was the abuse. So I bring all this stuff up because we haven't ever done anything to have any redress to this. There's been no reparations. Deb Haaland, as she was having the door hit her in the ass on her way out of the Biden administration, issued a report on the residential schools. She downplayed and diminished every single number. She called for 8 recommendations, which were mostly just word salads, apologies, some sort of studies to look at the impacts that the residential schools had on us. There was no dollar value, although she did come up with a dollar value. She said that should be used as an equivalent marker for how they should redress the residential schools. And what she did was she said, well, how much did we pay to commit this crime against Native people? So she had her staff, or her and Brian Newland, her assistant secretary, came up with a figure by taking all of the congressional appropriations to fund these residential schools, adjust them from inflation, and they came up with like $23.3 billion. And they said that should be the starting place. That should be what so essentially they said, let's figure out how much it cost us to commit genocide, and we'll use that number. So forget about the impacts. Forget about the cost to us. They were just figuring out what was the cost to them. And this is a Native person. Both Brian Newland and Deb Haaland are both Native. They worked for the Biden administration, and this is how they massaged the numbers. This is how they massaged the impact of residential schools. They said, well, let's figure out how much we paid to do these things. So as we go forward, and look, I address a lot of the stuff in the film. If you haven't seen The Long Hope, we hope to get it up on social media at some point. But coming out of the gate, I'm going to spend a great deal of the time this year taking our film on the road. So I'm going to be coming to cities. I hope to come to Washington and New York. I've been to New York already a couple of times. We've gone into Connecticut. We're going to go through Massachusetts. I'm going to take it out to other places. I hope to get out to Pittsburgh and Cleveland and out into Michigan and get down into Virginia and really make the rounds with this film. And what we will do is we will show the film, and it's a long one. It's a 2-hour film. We're going to show the film and then do a Q&A afterwards. And what I hope is, after we do this throughout 2026, and we basically spread some truth to all the propaganda that's going to be out there, both because of the election coming up, the midterm elections, and the celebration of the Declaration of Independence and all that other stuff. We're going to try to get this truth out there, and we hope that we can change some of the conversation. At very least, I hope that we can educate our own people, because our own people become complicit. And look, that complicity doesn't always come out as overtly as oh yeah, I'm a MAGA guy, I'm a Trump guy. You may not see that, but the thing is, silence is complicity as well. If we accept the labels that they impose on us, American Indians, Native Americans, Lumbee, if we accept the labels that they put on us, and look, I think it's fine to acknowledge that that's what they're calling us, but I think we should always respond to that. But that's not what we call ourselves. So I think we can begin that transition to reclaiming our identity by saying, look, I know you think I'm a Mohawk, but I'm really Gunyagahaga. So let me start there. And I think that's a good place to start. But the thing is, we have to become more outspoken. And I'm not saying we got to be combative necessarily, but let's be honest. Some of us are more combative than others. I mean, for some of us, it's our nature to be more combative. So somebody like me, I'm going to take a stronger position. So if you're in a Native community, or maybe you're not in a Native community, maybe you're still trying to struggle to reclaim some of that identity because you have grown up away from your culture, and I encourage you to do so, then help us. Help us reclaim some of that, and help you reclaim your identity. And you do that by learning what you can learn. Trace not just your roots, but who your family is. And I guess that's the same thing, roots and family, I guess. But learn who your ancestors are. And learn what communities they are from. And reach out to those communities. Yeah, look, there's going to be some pushback. Because of this whole pretendianism thing, there's going to be a lot of Native people who say, yeah, we don't trust you. But that mistrust is well-founded, and it's justifiable. But you know what? Persevere. I mean, go through it. Endear yourselves with your own actions. Look, support Native causes, both financially, morally, physically. And not all of you are going to be at the same place on that spectrum of what that looks like. What does advocacy look like? Well, for me, I take on big issues. I'm the reason has a ban against the use of Native mascots in all of its high schools and all of its public schools. I am the reason that happened. Not everybody sees the path to realize that kind of stuff. I did it to prove that you can do it, that I could do it. And I didn't have an expensive campaign. I didn't have a lobbying firm. I didn't have PR people around me. I wasn't a well-founded or well-funded campaign. I just did the work. So we live in a time now that we have so much information available to us everywhere. I mean, we are inundated with access to information, including the use of AI. For those who are scared of it, then stay away from it. But artificial intelligence, all that really is a means by which they can gather information and come up with a way to aggregate that information. That's really all AI is. It's an aggregate. It's not artificial intelligence. It's the gathering of man's written word, spoken word, and that's where. So, but if you're afraid of it, then stay away from it. There's still plenty of information. Of course, you're going to be hard pressed if you're using the internet to not be somewhat influenced by artificial intelligence because it's everywhere. But this is where human intelligence comes in. And of course, artificial intelligence is human intelligence. It's just an aggregate of it. But this is where your own judgment, your own critical thinking comes in. If someone or something, meaning AI, if something is telling you something that doesn't make any sense, then reject it and do the work to find out more. Find out more about the true history of a place, of a people, of a policy. Many of our people don't do that. Look, in 1988, when they passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which was this law that defined what was now going to be legal native gaming, There was no illegal native gaming before that. I mean, it was challenged and went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, well, we don't have any laws regulating native gaming, so they have a legal right to do it. But once they passed this law, which was the next year, many people loved it. They embraced it as, oh, yeah, see, now we can do it. You always could do it, but you had to have the nerve to do it. And the fact that you didn't, and now you're going to do it only within the context of what the federal government says you can do, and that's at its core, when I talk about plenary powers, this was it. So the Supreme Court basically says, we don't have any laws regarding native gaming, so they can do it. We don't have any means to say they can't. So Congress, through its use of plenary powers, this ultimate authority, they pass a law that says, okay, now we're going to tell you what is legal gaming and what isn't. And the only legal native gaming from a Class 3 standpoint, from a casino standpoint, is if a nation, a tribe, a group, a community, enters into a regulatory contract with the states that they're within. For one thing, this is one of the things that we fought against most. But the federal government passes this law that says legal gaming requires a compact with the state. So right out of the gate, this thing is oppressive because it's putting us at a disadvantage to the power of the states that surround us. But our people didn't push back. And they're still not pushing back, even though after 30 years of this thing, I take it back. So it's over 30 years. Over 30 years of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, it has proven itself to be an oppressive law. But our people still won't push back. And to the extent that they have, they end up having the Interior Department turn their back on them, having, regardless of party, Democrats, Republicans, they've all just turned their back. Anytime we said, this law hasn't really worked out quite right. It's not even fulfilling its mission. We're supposed to be the primary beneficiary of this, of native gaming. It says it right in the law, but we're not. And so what does the federal government do? Nothing. What did Deb Haaland do as the Secretary of Interior? Nothing. She claimed, well, maybe it's time to do a rewrite of some of the rules. She didn't do it. She said she pondered the thought of it, but then didn't do anything. So the Senecas get screwed by New York State, get over $2 billion taken directly from their gaming revenue, even though they were already the primary beneficiary because we don't have economies in our territories. So every dollar that came into our territory was going back into the state anyway, but they weren't even taking the dollars before it came into our possession. Half the revenue of Seneca Gaming went to the state right off the top. Right off the top. And the federal government just looked the other way, including Deb Haaland, Brian Newland, all of it. So even when we're being beaten down, and that is a beat down. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. Even when we're being beaten down, we've never been able to get any agency, including the one that is charged with the responsibility to make sure the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act was being properly administered, did nothing, even when it was a Native person. So when I talk about identity, part of the whole identity battle is knowing that we are in a pitted battle. You don't want to call it war because we're not talking necessarily about a bloody war, a bloody conflict. But you know what? It gets that way. There are Native people today that are being picked up by ICE, being mistaken for illegal immigrants. It's happening every single day. I sit here today, and I've said it here on the show, I'm not a lawful permanent resident of the United States, and I'm not a U.S. citizen. As far as they're concerned, I'm an undocumented, not really an immigrant, because I'm not an immigrant, but I'm an undocumented human being in the United States. If I'm considered, now where I'm sitting here right now, I'm in Seneca territory. I'm on the Cattaraugus territory of Seneca Nation, which is part of the reason I say that I'm not a lawful permanent resident. This is where I live. I live here. I live in Seneca territory. I don't live in the United States. I don't live in New York State. So because of the current policies, immigration policies of the United States, where they can literally round you up and send you to a prison in El Salvador, and then figure it out later whether that was just or not, and then when they find out that it's not just, argue, well, there's nothing we can do about it now. That's what they try to do with the guy from Connecticut or Rhode Island or whatever, wherever he's from, Gilmar O'Bragel. I mean, this is. I mean, it's we've reached a level of insanity that has become normalized in the United States. So when you consider that Native people to this day are still regarded as wards of the federal government, you know that it can go very badly, which is the reason we have to push back. I'm not saying just be belligerent for the sake of being belligerent, although I'd accept some of that even, I guess. I'm saying, no, understand, become aware. One of the things, look, even as we've done certain things like gotten involved in tobacco sales and fuel sales and cannabis sales, it's on us to understand why we can do these things on our territories, even when the state can't regulate them. It's why it's important. But if we're going to argue that the state can't regulate us this way, but they can regulate our gaming, well, there's a cognitive dissonance there. There's a problem with that. It's not consistent. So how do we get ourselves back on the footing to say, no, I don't care what the federal government says, we're not going to be run by the state. They don't run our gas, they don't run our tobacco trade, they don't run our cannabis trade, and they sure as hell aren't going to run our gaming industry. And we're not going to let them take half the money from our gaming industry. And I say this just here living in Seneca territory. This is replicated in territory after territory after territory across the entire continent. And now they're positioning themselves to treat the Hawaiian population, the native Hawaiian population, the Kanaka in the same manner. They're going to try to designate them as an Indian tribe. So while you're creating tribes out of people like with the Lumbees, you are also basically oppressing us by casting us as wards, as your wards, as incompetents, as a subclass of human existence. That still exists today. So when I talk about what this year is going to be about for me and the identity crisis, and we're going to deal with it. Look, I have people calling all the time that ask me about black Indians and black, Native people, and they call up and they want to discuss certain attributes or certain things like federal recognition, state recognition. We're gonna deal with some of that stuff as we go through this year. I'm not going to dwell on Independence Day or the midterm election. There's going to be enough people doing that already. But when it crosses over, I will talk about being called merciless Indian savages in the Declaration of Independence. I will point out what was said in that declaration that was meant to be an affront and cause violence to Native people. That I will discuss. But I'm not going to talk. I'm not singing happy birthday to the United States. So, again, I want to thank you for joining me. I do wish you a happy new year, but I wish that you make it a new year. I hope you treat this not as a replication of what transpired in 2025, but treat 2026 as an opportunity to do better, to do more, to do right. I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio, Yahweh.